Hello and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. Other Minds, founded in 1993 in San Francisco by Charles Amirkhanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On season 3 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 28th Other Minds Festival, which will take place September 25th to 28th, 2024 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. You're listening to Polytempo music by Brian Baumbusch, performed by the San Francisco Contemporary Music Players. Brian Baumbusch is a composer, instrument designer, and musicologist whose works engage the use of new technologies while also drawing on deep cross-cultural histories. Baumbusch's Polytempo music is being issued in 3 different formats simultaneously: as a compact disc on Other Minds Records, a virtual reality application for the Meta Quest headset, and a mobile app for both Apple and Android users. The CD version is available now at the Other Minds Bandcamp page and web store. Today we're bringing you an interview with Baumbusch, conducted by Other Minds board member Bari Scott, live at the David Brower Center in Berkeley, California, on June 28th, 2024.
It's so nice to have you all here. I'm Charles Amirkhanian of Other Minds, and I'd like to thank you for attending this first demonstration of Polytempo music by Brian Baumbusch. This is a pretty special piece of music that is performed on recording by the San Francisco Contemporary Music Players. You know, in music you have rhythm, you have all sorts of parameters, harmony that you can use as a composer, but if you have a lot of notes all compressed together, it's really good if you can separate them in space. And so spatial music is sort of what's going on in the context of Brian Baumbusch's new project. He's a composer who has gone back and forth to Bali many times, built Balinese instruments, and instruments that are based on Balinese instruments, and has left them there for other young musicians to perform. And in a couple of months, we'll be working on a new album of his that will have those instruments as the main voices of the music. But his connection to the American experimental tradition really started when he went to Bard and studied with Kyle Gann, who had just written a book on the player piano studies of Conlon Nancarrow. And of course, those studies are very important musically because there are so many different tempi in each voice playing at a different speed. It could only be done at that time in the 40s by a player piano and punching holes in a player piano roll. So now we have computers, and the next generation of experiments like this, like Polytempo music, are here. And in order to separate the voices in a Nancarrow study, he would put each voice in a different range of the piano. So in the low range you have one voice, and then the mid-range another. And sometimes you would have 12 going at once. But when you do that in a concert hall with instruments, the previous way to do it, as Henry Brandt did, was to put the instruments all over the hall. Now, what do you do when you want to replicate this for people today who have home stereos and maybe binaural headphones? You can use the various systems that are being developed so that the sounds literally play around the space when you close your eyes and can be separated one from the other. And this Brian has done ingeniously, and we'll hear more about that as the evening goes on. He's going to be interviewed by my friend Bari Scott, who worked with me at KPFA for many years. Bari is a radio producer. She also has won many Peabody Awards and just about every radio award you could win for series she's done, including the DNA Files and early programs on artificial intelligence. This was in the 70s. And she's a real pioneer. She lives here in the Bay Area. and is a member of the board of directors of Other Minds, and I'm really honored to have her here tonight. She is the pride of Marshall, Texas, where she grew up, and her uncle was the president of Wiley College, an HBCU in Texas. And so she has a family background of a lot of academic achievement, and she's a fantastic human being, and was the first director of the Third World Department at KPFA when I was working there in the mid-'70s. So here are Bari Scott and Brian Baumbusch.
So Brian, we finally made it here, huh? So we'll see how you feel afterwards. I had gotten a bio of you, and if we was to read the bio, we'd be here all day, because he's done a lot, And so what I'll just say in short is, you're very talented.
Thank you.
And you're super smart.
Okay.
And you have a wonderful background that we'll get a chance to hear how that has culminated to what we're going to hear today. Working in a lot of genres to be able to bring music and some of the permeations of it so that we can enjoy it in a 3D way or in a big, broad way so that we can feel it and see it and it's not distinct from us, which is what I like. I was also taken with the fact that you build your own instruments or many instruments, and you build microphones, being in radio, that was exciting. And being a Texas person, one of the things about Texas people is we love our football and we love our sports. And you were a running back in your high school football team, and you were also the captain of your basketball team. Well, this is a little sideline. When it comes to experimental musicians, I don't think of football players and basketball players. I think of maybe swimmers or, what somebody say, badminton players or curlers or something like that. So, in a very lighthearted way, how does having been part of sports and team sports intermingled with your style of performing or writing, envisioning?
I think with sports, there's the first thing I want to say is there's discipline. You have to learn discipline, and you have to learn to be disciplined with a group of people, and commingle with them without butting heads too much. And so I think people who like music often don't realize, if they haven't learned how to play music, how much discipline goes into that. I would say as much as a professional athlete, or maybe more, and sometimes, because there's a labor of love to it that carries a lot of discipline in the weight that it puts on you. So I think those two things were, I enjoyed working hard and being disciplined, and I enjoyed working with other people. And once I realized that there was something cathartic about music that sports could never give me, that was enough to totally change.
Now, you started off loving classical music and playing the classical guitar.
Yeah.
So what was the jam that made you say, oh, this is the tune this is what I want to do. I want to get into all of this, new music, creative music work. Who turned you on to that? Or what piece turned you on?
Well, there's a person, actually. But certainly, so I had a formative experience going to the Interlochen Arts Academy in high school after I left the public high school where I was playing a lot of sports. And the people that I met there absolutely changed the course of my life and are still the most inspiring people, I think, when I look back on it. But there was one particular guy, Eric Buchner, who was an older, I think he was 2 or 3 years older than me. And he introduced me to Nan Carroll, Balinese gamelan music, electronic musicians like Daedalus, Tuvan throat singing, all sorts of things that, just opened my ears in a way that the radio stations of Northern Virginia couldn't do up until that time. So I think, just the curiosity, and once you learn that it can hit something inside, then you get this kind of hunger for it. But other people are the ones who kind of feed you, I guess, at first.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you've referenced is the role of minimalism in your development. What about minimalism that inspired you?
I think, I was listening to a lot of music at the age that I just first heard, let's say, Music for 18 Musicians was one of the early minimalist pieces that really affected me. And I think the way that it changed my perception of time was different than any music I had heard up until that point, where the way you perceive the passage of time is all of a sudden in this new state. And I think a lot about like the flow. People, psychologists talk about this flow state that your mind can go into sometimes when you're in a kind of a focus. And I think music, some of the minimalist pieces that are working on these really long time scales can get me there in a way that's really satisfying. Smoking weed as a 16-year-old didn't hurt those feelings too.
We weren't going to bring that up. I was going to bring up Colin Nankara, not that. So, Charles, you never told me that Colin Nankara was from Texarkana. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that, and with Taj Mahal would say, Texas people like those big sounds. And so in listening to those piano rolls, and my grandmother had a piano, but it seemed all tinny to me, But Nankaro's pieces, are heavy. They have weight. So
they're bangers, as we
So does that? So does that factor in any way in terms of how you conceptualize music? Because you've mentioned him a few times.
I think Nankaro. When I learned about Nankaro, that was the most, let's call it, virtuosic thing that I had heard in terms of how you could shape and bend time in a way that seems like magic. Like, how is this even possible? And your ear immediately recognizes it as something that it's never heard before, because it hasn't, until you've heard Nankaro's music or anything that's bending time like that. There's no other music that does that. So, Nankaro was, I think, he's also hard to listen to be honest. It would be hard for me to sit down and listen to an hour of Nankaro, because listening to 3 minutes, like a 3-minute player piano study, feels already like 2 hours. There's like enough notes in there already.
Yeah, he did have a lot of notes. Well, before we go on, I hope each of you got one of these little sheets, so keep it. Because one of the things that Brian is going to do is demonstrate his program, but also allow you to call out some instructions. So you'll kind of need this. We'll explain it to you later, so hold on to it. All right, so Brian, I have to be honest. I had a hard time trying to figure out where to start.
Okay.
Because one of the things I kind of gathered is, in a way, just like what you were doing with your immersive, interactive presentation, if you start some questions over in this area, I'm imagining a hex tree up here at the top, and you tell us what that is later, we would end up with this whole set of questions and ideas and things. And if I start over here, so I had to take a deep breath. And Charles kind of already took my intro, but I'll start anyway by saying Polytempo exists in a lot of various forms: classical music, jazz, African drumming, Balinese music, etc. But you named your album Polytempo music. Where do you get off doing that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to unpack a little bit that term, polytempo, what it refers to, because there's another very close term that's used in the context of a lot of music, which is polyrhythm. And I would describe polyrhythm as being a type of polytempo, but a limited one where the rhythms that you're hearing are fixed. They could speed up and slow down together, but they maintain some sort of ratiometric cohesion. When it gets to something that's polytempo but not polyrhythmic, it requires doing calculus, which is what Nancarrow had to do. If you wanted to bend time such that you have something speeding up while something else slows down, and you wanted to keep track of them in real time, you're doing calculus to understand the relationship. So I think the reason why I named the piece Polytempo Music was because that was my goal in going into writing the piece, which is how much can I explore the possibility of bending time in different streams and in different ways, and keeping track of it. And it was, I had started, I'd say the first piece that I wrote that could be classified as polytempo dates back to almost 10 years ago, 2015. And I was limited to only 4 tempo streams at that time. And I didn't really have a good sense of, let's call it the score, like the real-time coordination of everything. And over the last 10 years, I've worked my way toward understanding and having the tools to be able to see time, pull back the curtain on those time relationships to the point that I felt ready to do a really ambitious piece. So I felt like I had the gall to call it.
It was very ambitious. You had 12 players, each on a different time tempo frame.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot for the ear, too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk about. Well, I will say, I have had a chance to listen to your album. I really have enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really have. You know, I was able to go on the journey, you know, go on the ride, sit on the wings of the little birds and fly about with your music. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot, and I didn't tire of it at all. Yeah, I thought it was really great. Because we want to just move on to COVID has a place in your development of this piece. What was going on there that led you to have to produce and to think in the way that you did? Where were you trying to resolve?
Yeah, I mean, in a weird way, there was this. So in March of 2020. I had just finished a big project, which was how I met Charles, actually. He commissioned it. And I did some limited polytempo things in the context of a larger, let's call it an oratorio. Or Charles called it a horror-oratorio, which I thought was a great term. And I developed a little bit of a reputation, I think, at least in the Bay Area, among other musicians and conductors, as somebody who worked with click tracks in live performance, and who was doing these sort of, and by click track, I'm referring to essentially a metronome that is fixed on a timeline. And, you know, oftentimes click tracks are used in film scores to synchronize music to a real-time occurrence. I use click tracks so that I can keep track of complicated time structures moving around, which are sort of outside of the bounds of what human perception can do, at least now, in terms of executing that type of complicated rhythmic structure. So I immediately got a commission in March of 2020, like instantly, to do a piece for a wind ensemble that they could collaborate on remotely, all recording one by one. And when I had that opportunity, all of a sudden, I could write much more complicated music, knowing that I never had to deal with the musicians all being in the room together. Because when I had to deal with that limitation, not only did I have to figure out how to run all of the channels to them, but then I had to deal with the bickering musicians being like, I can't play my part because he's playing something else. You know, it's hard to coordinate. And so now that nobody had to know what anybody else was doing, I could make much more complicated structures. And so that kind of paved the way to me to first do it in the context of making a stereo recording, and then wanting to do that same recording method and spatialize it so that you could move around it and change the way you're listening to it. So COVID was like, I think all the technology for what I was doing was available long before COVID, but COVID was what gave like other artists the willingness to go there with me. And that wasn't the case before, I think.
I wanted to ask you about preparing the musicians and preparing and writing the scripts, if you will, for that.
Yeah.
When people are performing in different locations, they're not together. How did you make that work?
Well, in that early piece, not in this piece, but the wind ensemble piece, I had this big Google Drive that just essentially, I had written what amounts to an orchestral score of like a symphonic length, 20, 30 minutes of music. And I divided the score instead of into, whatever 20 different lines, it was 20 lines, and each line was divided into little fragments from the score. So then that gave me the option to allow musicians to just record little fragments at a time, and they would send them to me. And because they were to these click tracks that synchronized, I could build a full mix. In the context of this piece, I essentially wrote music that was way more difficult for some of the world's best musicians. And my goal was to give them every possible practice method that they might want, because in that case they weren't going to record by themselves. They were going to then have to come into my studio and do it with me. So there was a little bit pressure on those moments, and but otherwise, the compiling of all the materials was similar to what I had done before. But then there was this added thing of building trust with the musicians and then I think a lot of them we did at least 4 sessions, or maybe I can't remember, 3 or 4 sessions, but some of them wanted to do more because they didn't want to have to record as much material in a single session. And in the first session, for most of the musicians, there was a little nervous, I think, on both sides, once they realized that I was kind of there to help them, and they that we both had a clear vision of how to get through the material. It became fun at the end, I would say. I developed a good personal relationship with all the musicians, some of which are here.
Okay, so you wanted to have the audience have an immersive experience, and an interactive experience. I'm
gonna push back on the word audience and just say listener.
The listener. Okay. I didn't know exactly what to call us. Yeah. I didn't know what to call us. Listener, viewer.
I like
public.
Listener. I think listener is a good term.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, how did you go about trying to achieve? What methods were you using to try to achieve that immersive and interactive experience? And why interactive?
Well, I think Charles mentioned this a little bit in the beginning, but the more cacophonous you make music, the harder it is to pull out the strands of it in listening to it, especially if it's a fixed stereo recording. It's definitely something is added by seeing a full orchestra or a large ensemble on the stage, and even if it sounds cacophonous, you can watch what a musician is doing, and that might direct your ear into it. But my game was to make a recording, not to make a live performance. And so how do you open up people's ears to a recording that's so dense at times? And my thinking was, well, I can just move sounds around in a 3-dimensional way and show depictions of how they're moving that relates to what you're hearing. And that will open your ears as its own sort of method, but then giving you the ability to move around it or have some sense of how you're moving around the space and how that's changing how you're hearing, was what I wanted to do with the music, really. So it's sort of, I would say, I started with an audience of one, which is me, just thinking about how do I want to be able to hear this music, and that was what I came to. Or this is what I came to.
You talk about 3D, hearing almost in 3D, using, and if I'm saying the words wrong, let me know, audio spatialization.
Sure.
So that you're in the center of all of this sound. So you have to use algorithms in order to program it in such a way so that it's more than just left and right, but it's on top, below. Is that right? Okay. And so with the interactive, you wanted to create some programming tool so that we could visually experience it. Exactly. So can you tell me a little bit about what you were inventing and developing to pull this off?
I feel like I should start showing you.
Okay.
How do you feel about that?
Okay.
So, to preface what I'm about to show, I started by developing this whole project as something that was very immersive, that you would experience with a VR headset. And only in the last couple months, I had decided and then had enough development skills to rebuild that whole project as something that works as a mobile application that you could use on an iPhone or Android. And so what I want to show first is what that application looks like, and that'll give me a really clear way to demonstrate what's going on in the sense of interactive spatial audio, and then transition into showing some content on the headset. So I'm going to cue up this one of my favorite moments from the piece. I'm very fortunate that the harpist is here right now, but I had some incredible recording sessions with her, and I'm going to start by playing just the harp part from the 10th movement of the piece. So notice that what I'm doing is I'm moving around this little avatar that shows where I am as the listener. As I get closer to the harp, it gets louder. And what it's doing is it's drawing a waveform trail that it's leaving as it moves around this 3D space. And I can rotate around it to see what type of shape it's leaving. I could listen to that all day, but I have to stop. Bravo to Kristen.
Yeah, actually. So that was in movement 10, is that right?
From movement 10.
Movement 10,
yeah.
I can't remember.
Which has 12 instruments in it, but I just isolated only the harp. Maybe I should show some parts with more instruments.
That would be good.
So now that you've had the sense of what it looks like as one instrument is moving around and how you can move around the stage, I want to show an example from movement 5. And so one thing I want to describe is what you're seeing in terms of how these sound sources are moving around. First of all, there's a depiction of the real-time location of the sound, which is this little ring up here, and that shows where the sound is at any given moment. And then what it's leaving behind is, think of it like a contrail, like what a jet leaves behind. But in this case, it's showing you the waveform, showing the energy of the sound that it's left. So the trail is almost like a visual score, and it gives a cue to your ear to understand what you're hearing. So what I'm going to go to now is, actually, let me explain a little bit more about the animation. So by animation, I'm talking about the path that the speakers, I think of them as speakers rather than instruments because they look like little speakers. The path that the speakers take is a very involved choreography, which is composed at the same level of granularity that the music is composed in. But really, it was my way of thinking, how do I want to spatialize the audio in a way that would be meaningful, but also to create something aesthetically beautiful in the process of doing so. So there was these two priorities. So what you're going to see in this next part is an animation where in the bottom of the stage, as I think of it, you're going to see these concentric circles moving around that are kind of in the blue-green color spectrum, and those are all the wind instruments. And then there's an upper array of instruments moving around that are going to be sort of more red and then going up to yellow. And the red instruments are all string instruments, and the yellow ones are, let's say, the percussion instruments. So what I'm going to do is move around and navigate that vertical space. And as you do, you'll hear that the winds are going to come into prominence as I move down, and the strings are going to come into prominence in the audio that you're hearing as I move up. Now notice as I get closer to some instruments, not only do you hear it louder, but you see the trails thicker and more prominently because they're responding to your position. So that example showed essentially how you can navigate the orchestration of the piece. And that's really what those animations are designed to do. I have another example that I want to show how the animations are correlated with this polytempo structure of the music. So this next example, this is going to be from movement 9. And in what's happening in the beginning of movement 9 is there are essentially 2 different tempo streams. One of them that's moving at a faster rate, another one that's moving at a slower rate. And they move together, and they'll maintain some amount of let's call it polyrhythmic, ratiometric meaning between them, but then over time they combine to be a single tempo. So the faster one slows down, the slower one speeds up. And the way the animations are choreographed is all of the faster moving instruments are in an array of circles on the top of the stage, and all the slower moving instruments are on the bottom of the stage. And then in the middle of the stage is another group of instruments that are playing, I think of it as it sounds like a pizzicato line. In fact, there's a number of string instruments playing pizzicato, and they're finding these notes that are kind of common to the 2 lines. So what I'm going to do is move the listener to the top of the stage and to the bottom of the stage so that you can really hear these different tempo relationships. And then when they combine to become a single tempo, you'll see that the animations bring those 2 physical arrays together into the center. And then I'll show you how you can sort of move around to each individual instrument, and then you'll see them spread apart again as their tempos split, and then come back together as they come back together. So this is from movement 9.
That was good. We like that one, huh?
I want to acknowledge one of the really important people in what you just heard, which is Kyle Bruckman, the oboist. He is that bluest of the lines that we just saw.
Well, I did want to ask you,
Please.
working with the musicians, and then talk a little bit about virtual reality and the colors that you chose.
Yeah.
So you had 12 musicians.
Yeah.
And so each one of them were given their instructions, their click tracks, etc. Was that difficult for them to do all by themselves?
It was easy. Yeah, no problem. Every composer should do that. No, they worked really hard. They worked really hard. This was really hard music. I think that almost broke the bank, let's say. I mean, it was as hard of a thing that I could have possibly asked them to do, I think. I don't think I could have taken it even one step further. And I'm so fortunate.
Tell me a little bit about that. So you sent them a package of what?
It was in a Google Drive, and it had their parts to all of the 12 movements. Each part had this form of notation that took us a little while to come up with what was going to work best from them, but it had all the indications of when they'd be speeding up and slowing down. Certain musicians wanted to see different versions of their own individual part, depending whether or not it made sense to them to understand what their part is doing over a fixed time score versus looking at their part in a more traditional style notation that shows a cello rondo and ritardando. And then accompanying the part was other folders of all sorts of different click tracks. That would be, if you want to, how do you play along to this when the pulse that you're hearing is a quarter note or an eighth note or a 16th note? And are you going to practice along to some mock-up, some guide track that where you can also hear the notes that you're going to play or an intonation, so
they're not hearing what other people are doing or knowing what the other parts are.
You'd have to ask them, but my impression was that they were concerned with their job.
Their part.
That was enough. I think few of them went to go reference the full score, and at that point there was no full recording, but there was a synthesized rendition of the full piece. So, but that didn't help them in any way.
And so they each came into the studio to record their piece all by themselves.
Yeah, a third of it at a time was the original goal. It would be they'd record 4 movements in one session, and then they'd have another 2 or 3 months to learn the next 4 movements, and then they come do that. And then some of them elongated that whole process to pretty much a year, almost a year. Because they didn't want to have to record 4 entire movements in a single session.
So you would have all their pieces, and then it was up to you to layer it all together? Is that how that worked?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, at that point in my career, let's say as a producer of recordings, I had a really fast workflow in terms of how many takes I knew that they needed to do, how to arrange them in a way that I could then quickly edit it down to a single mix, such that, and I got better too, because I was, I did maybe 60 recording sessions total. I was at all of them. Each musician was at 4 or 5 or something. So by the end, I was really good at it. I could create an edit of what they had done in a 4-hour session in 40 minutes, I think. But just because I knew how to arrange it in a way that was meaningful, and I knew how to tell myself when they had gotten a good take,
You also use virtual reality tools to pull this together.
Well, you mean artificial intelligence? Is that what you mean?
Virtual reality.
Oh, virtual reality tools.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then I was going to ask about artificial intelligence.
Well, you mean the software?
The software,
or
yeah.
It's not really a software, but
well, what is it if it's not the software?
I don't know. Scott would know. What do you call Unity?
A game engine.
A game engine.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so so Unity is mm-hmm. what we use to develop all of this, and it's historically something that has been used to make games, which are interactive experiences. So in the last decade or so, a lot of programmers have used Unity to do other types of interactive experiences that aren't exactly games. You know, this is maybe on the border of what exactly it is. And that was about a 2-year process, I think, working in Unity and doing all the development to create the user interface, all the spatial audio settings, and then all of the choreography, the animations, all the visual effects. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned AI, jumped the gun on
Yeah,
that one.
sorry.
So how did you use artificial intelligence in pulling this all together?
As a coding aid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, once you get to the point that you understand what codes can do in a game engine like this, and you know the logic of how the code is going to compile and be designed, then it's kind of a waste of your human time to sit down and enter all the syntax yourself, to be perfectly frank, because AI can do that now in seconds. So I think, you know, that was a point where I think, you know, I was so new to this in the beginning. Scott, who's here in the audience, Scott Looney, who was the lead developer, he taught me a lot in the early days, and he also showed me a little bit how you could use AI to you know. And so once I knew enough with the aid of AI to make codes, then it meant Scott didn't have to make code, he could do other things in the project. So
you're not worried that AI at some point could get irritated and say, I needed this to be in C major and not in and change the notes or something like that for you? You know?
I do. What his aesthetic preferences are, that's a little bit beyond me. But I do have like a superstition that I'm going to irritate it and then it's going to sabotage. Because it certainly gives a lot of wrong answers. In fact, most of what it gives are wrong answers. But if you can find a way to hone those in and find the right answer, it's still faster, at least for me, since I had zero background in coding before I started doing this project. It's faster than working through your own errors, right? But I do feel at times, you know, sometimes it seems like deliberate sabotage. Mm-hmm. So I try to be nice. I'm like, would you please write me a C# Unity code with a cherry on top?
close? Is that
Yeah, I think we're coming to a
I
close.
just want to ask about murmuration real quickly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so just tell me about murmuration in terms of your pieces
Yeah.
in this piece here.
Well, so murmuration is referring to this way. It's usually used in the context of how starlings, the birds, fly around. It's kind of similar to shoaling of fish, but to me, the types of patterns that are made is sort of a metaphor for something aesthetically that's really interesting to me that music can aspire towards. And I think one of my goals in doing these dense polytempo structures is, if I can be successful at doing it, it evokes those types of patterns where you see a whole body moving together that's comprised of all of these smaller bodies, and you see how they move synchronously with one another. But if you were to look at a single one, you wouldn't necessarily tell that that's what they're doing, and it would be really hard to discern how they're doing it together. And there's a movement in the piece where it's probably the most cacophonous in terms of 12 tempos moving all over, very fluidly changing, and the animations are showing what that might look like. So thanks.
At some point, it all comes together and it fans out.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I wanted to know is, in this structure that you have, are you the main murmurer? Because, birds, it might be, like some wave or something might make them go this way. So who determines the coming together of the flight pattern? Are you that bird?
Yeah, I think I wrote the music before doing the animation. And so the animation in that section is responding to these kind of on a dime changes that happen in the music, the way that you might see a murmuration of birds all of a sudden change directions. But predicting when they're going to do that is nearly impossible, and that's kind of what the music is designed to do too. So.
And my very, very last question, because I read something about this in one of the things I was looking at, I don't know where, and at one point it was saying using the click tracks, having people, record in the way that you had, opens up all kinds of wonderful possibilities for the future. And so do you think there's a trade-off too? I mean, there's all the great ways that you don't have to be in the same room. You can have people in different locations all come together in this way. But is there a trade-off at the same time?
Certainly, because it's a socially isolating way of experiencing music. In fact, for me, doing something like this is very cathartic because it gives me an opportunity to share it with people, which is not normal. It's not otherwise possible. But I think that there's something important to making personal experiences. Not that that's what we ought to spend all or even most of our time doing, but if we are going to have personal experiences, it's nice to have them be really meaningful and immersive. I also hope that this type of music could be learned to be played together in some future time. And certainly the San Francisco contemporary music players, they did perform the last third of this piece, and it was a really special experience. But part of the reason why they only performed the last third is it would have been a huge challenge, and there would have been a lot of resources that would have had to go into making the full piece come to life. So I think my hope is in part that doing something like this will inspire musicians to have a hunger for that challenge in the future.
Well, you all, the musicians who are here, you all were great. And I love them. And I really did love this CD. And so, thank you.
That was Bari Scott interviewing composer Brian Baumbusch about his piece Polytempo Music. Available now from Other Minds Records as a CD and digital download. You can pick up a copy today from the Other Minds Bandcamp and web store. The virtual reality application for the Meta Quest headset and a mobile app are available from Baumbusch's holography label. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast for our upcoming interviews with the composers of Other Minds Festival 28. This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 28th festival is September 25th to 28th, 2024 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco.